I had not spoken to another person in 9 days when Wednesday evening arrived, and 9 days was not even a record for me. That was just how things went out here. The Dunvara Lighthouse sat on a narrow finger of basalt that jutted into the Minch off the northwest coast of Scotland, connected to the mainland coastal path by a single-track strip of ground that flooded at high tide and turned to black mud in rain. Which meant it flooded at high tide and turned to black mud almost always in March. The lighthouse itself was mid-Victorian, white-painted, with the paint peeling back in long strips near the base where the salt got into it. The keeper's cottage had 2 rooms. The main room held a table, a VHF radio set, a small gas hob, and a shelf of paperback books with warped spines. The back room had a bunk and a chest of drawers. That was it. The fog signal outbuilding sat 10 feet from the cottage across an exposed walkway, connected by a galvanized steel handrail I gripped with both hands in heavy weather. The nearest settlement was Dunvara Village, 4 miles south along the coast. Population under 80, no doctor, the nearest hospital in Ullapool 50 miles by road. I had been the sole full-time keeper here for 11 years. I took the posting after my son Owen drowned in a boating accident off the Caithness coast. Owen had been 19, and the boat had been a small recreational vessel I had bought him for his birthday, and that was the end of that line of thinking, which was exactly why I put 4 miles of coastal path and the permanent sound of the Minch between myself and most of the world. The Northern Lighthouse Board was happy enough to have me. Keepers who wanted remoteness were easier to retain than keepers who had to be persuaded into it. I drank from a rainwater collection tank mounted on the cottage roof. This started 3 years in, when the supply pipe from the mainland developed a corrosion problem I had reported twice to the board and which had been partially repaired. Partially. I never fully trusted the tap after that. The tank held enough for 3 weeks of careful use. I checked the level every morning out of habit, the way I checked the barometer and the lamp timer. 3 years ago, a routine CT scan at Regmore Hospital in Inverness found a small calcified cyst near my brainstem. The Northern Lighthouse Board required scans every 5 years for keepers over 50. The radiologist described the cyst as benign, consistent with an old minor bleed, almost certainly congenital. It was monitored annually. The last checkup was in November and confirmed it remained unchanged. I had not thought about it since. My contact with the village was minimal and regular. Bobby Noble, the Royal Mail postman, did a Tuesday and Thursday run, arriving at the lighthouse between 10:15 and 10:40. Always 3 unhurried taps on the door. Always the same 4 or 5 things. Something about the weather. Whether I needed anything brought next time. Occasionally something about his wife Maya's health, which was not good. Raymond Bradley at Dunvara Stores had supplied my monthly provisions for 9 years. Tinned goods, oatmeal, the particular brand of instant coffee I had drunk since I was 25. These were the coordinates of my social world. They were enough. Wednesday evening, I was in the lamp room doing a routine check. The cloth moved in careful circles across each prism face, the beam already on its automated 4-second cycle. The wind was running at 15 knots from the northwest and building. I noted the barometer had dropped 2 millibars since the afternoon reading. Nothing unusual for March. I set the cloth down and descended the 42 stairs. The number came automatically now, the way breathing did. I crossed the main room, went into the back room, and lay down on the bunk. Nothing was wrong. Everything was exactly as it had always been. I lay there listening to the Minch work against the basalt below, and the lighthouse beam swept its 4-second arc above me, and I was, as far as I knew, entirely alone and entirely fine. I was up in the lamp room doing my weekly lens check when the banging started below. I had the cloth in one hand and the bottle of optical cleaner in the other, working the careful circular motion across each prism, face the way I'd done it 1,000 times before. The wind was already running at 20 knots from the northwest and building, but I heard the noise even over that. It wasn't a knock. Not the usual 3 taps Bobby Noble did every Tuesday and Thursday. unhurried. The knock of a man who had all morning and knew it. This was two-fisted, sustained. The sound of someone hitting the door with the flat of both palms and not stopping. I set down the cloth and went to the lamp room's narrow window and looked down the tower's exterior. I could see the top of a figure's head on the cottage doorstep. Red hair plastered flat by the rain. I came down the spiral staircase, 42 steps. I unlocked the interior door into the cottage, crossed to the front door, and opened it. Bobby Noble stood on the step without his jacket. He was in his postal uniform shirt, dark with rain, and he was breathing in short, rapid pulls through his nose. His chest was working fast and shallow. He was staring at a point on my chest, not at my face. His hands were still raised from the knocking, not quite fists, not quite open. I said his name. Bobby. His eyes came up slowly to my face. For 2 or 3 seconds, something moved across his expression. Confusion, the specific kind that looks like waking up, like a man who has heard his own name called in a dream and is not sure whether he is in the dream or out of it. Then it closed off completely. He shoved the day's post into my chest with both hands, hard enough that I stepped back and hit the edge of the doorframe. Then he turned and walked back down the path to his Royal Mail van without speaking. I watched him go, holding the scattered envelopes against my chest. The van's brake lights came on briefly as it reached the headland track. Then it turned south and disappeared. It was 6:40 in the morning. Bobby's regular Thursday run did not begin until 10. He drove out from the Dunvara sorting office, hit the coastal farms, and reached the Lighthouse last, arriving between 10:15 and 10:40 depending on road conditions. He had done this every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years. He was a quiet, careful man who said the same 4 or 5 things on every visit. Something about the weather. Something about whether I needed anything brought next time. Occasionally something about his wife Maya's health, which was not good. He had never arrived before 8. He had never arrived without his jacket. I stood in the doorway until the sound of the van engine faded entirely. Then I looked down at the post. A water bill, a board circular, and a handwritten note on the back of an order form from Dunvara Stores, Raymond Bradley's shop, which had been supplying my monthly provisions for 9 years. Tinned goods and oatmeal, and the particular brand of instant coffee I'd drunk since I was 25. The note was in handwriting I didn't recognize, blocky and slightly uneven. It read, "Monthly delivery canceled until further notice." No signature, no explanation. I went inside and tried the VHF. Every channel produced the same low, steady interference. Not static, which had texture and variation, but a flat, continuous warble. The same pitch on every frequency, including the distress channel. I tried my mobile next. Signal out here was unreliable in the best conditions, but today it connected on the first attempt, which was unusual. Then it dropped before the call went through. I tried again. Same thing. A third time. Each time cutting just as the line opened. I went to the window with my binoculars. 3 miles south, at the small fishing quay that served the 2 remaining commercial boats out of Dunvara, I could see movement. The Morag Jean and the Ardmore Girl, both Creel boats working the inshore grounds, were usually out by now, but the quay was occupied. A figure was pulling another figure across the keystones by the arm. The dragged person's heels scored lines in the wet stone. A third figure stood at the water's edge. As I watched, this third person bent down, straightened, and threw something in a long arc into the Minch, the silhouette of a crab pot turning end over end. Then the figure bent and threw again, then another, then another. I lowered the binoculars. I went up to the roof and checked the rainwater tank, 3/4 full. I noted this without knowing why it seemed important. I went back inside and stood in the middle of the cottage and waited. Then I went back to the window with the binoculars. The quay was visible again now, the rain thinning enough to see clearly. The figures were still there. The crab pots were gone, thrown into the minch one after another, deliberate and methodical. I stood at the cottage window with the binoculars lowered, the crab pots gone into the minch, the quay 3 miles south now still, and I did not yet have a word for what I had just seen. Raymond Bradley and his son Walter came up the coastal path 40 minutes after I'd come back inside. I saw them from the window. Raymond in his blue store apron over a heavy coat, Walter behind him in work trousers and rubber boots, the kind he wore when he was doing deliveries. Raymond was 61 and had run Dunvara stores for 30 years. He knew my order by heart. He'd once driven the supply run himself during a February storm 3 years back when his driver called in sick, arriving at the Lighthouse with the boxes already packed and a flask of tea he'd brought for me without being asked. Walter was 28 or 29, quiet the way his father was not, more comfortable with crates than conversation. I opened the door and called across to them. Raymond's name, then Walter's. I asked if everything was all right, if there was a problem with the delivery. Raymond tilted his head at the sound of my voice. The movement was wrong. Not the natural tilt of a man turning toward a sound, but something slower. The head moving as if the sound were a physical pressure that had to be accommodated. Then he started walking again, faster, and Walter followed without a word. I got the door shut, and the bolt thrown before Raymond's shoulder hit it. They did not shout. That was the thing I would come back to for a long time afterward. There was no shouting, no language, no demand or threat or explanation. Just the impact of fists on the wooden door, and seconds later, on the cottage's single window. The glass cracked on the third or fourth blow, a diagonal fracture running from the upper left corner. I pushed the table against the door with my hip and held it there, my back against the table's far edge, listening to the rhythm of the impacts. It was methodical in a way that was worse than rage would have been. Rage had a shape. This didn't. It stopped, not winding down. Stopped, as if a switch had been thrown. I waited with my hands flat on the table surface, not moving. 5 minutes. Then I looked through the cracked glass. Raymond was sitting on the path with his back against the lighthouse wall, his head down, rocking forward and back in a slow, even movement. Walter was standing 20 feet further along the path, facing the sea, his arms at his sides, not moving. I looked at my own right hand and found it bleeding. A cut across the base of my index finger where I'd pushed hard against the metal edge of the shelf during the barrage. I wrapped it in a dish towel from the hob rail and pulled the knot tight with my teeth. I stood in the middle of the cottage and made myself think in order. The VHF was still producing the flat warble. The mobile was still dropping calls. The window was cracked. Raymond and Walter were outside, quiescent for now. The coastal path lay between me and the village. I went through what I had. The rainwater tank 3/4 full. Tinned goods on the shelf. The lamp running on its automated timer. The fog signal on its 6-hour manual check cycle. To reach the fog signal controls, I'd have to cross the 10-foot walkway to the outbuilding. The walkway was exposed on both sides to the wind and to anyone standing on the path below. I looked at the 2 figures outside and decided not to cross it yet. The weather came in hard from the northwest around noon. The forecast had been for a system to arrive by evening, but it arrived early. The barometer dropping fast. The wind going from 20 knots to 40 in under an hour. The rain shifting from vertical to horizontal. By 12:30, the headland path had disappeared into gray, and the sea was white from the rocks to the horizon. I worked through the VHF channels one by one. On the distress frequency, channel 16, I got a response. A voice, briefly, cutting through the interference. "Stay where you are." Then static. I tried 3 more times and got nothing but the warble. I counted the people I could still make out through the cracked window and the rain. Raymond was still against the wall. Walter had moved. He was standing at the base of the headland path now, near the fork where the coastal track met the lighthouse approach. There was a second figure beside him. I couldn't make out who it was in the rain and the failing light. It wasn't yet 2 in the afternoon, but the March dark was already pressing in from the east. I stood at the cracked window in the early afternoon dark, watching 2 figures at the base of the headland path through the rain, and the voice on Channel 16, "Stay where you are," was the only human communication I'd received all day. By late afternoon, I counted 9 people on the coastal path. I recognized most of them by the particular way they stood and moved, identifiers accumulated over a decade of seeing the same people against the same backdrop. The 2 Dunvara Creole fishermen were there. Brian Rivera, in his 50s, who ran the Morag Jean, had a way of standing with his weight distributed that I could pick out even at a distance. His younger brother Liam worked the Ardmore girl and moved differently, lighter on his feet. Carolyn Dean was there too. She ran the Dunvara post office and had sold me my phone top-up cards for 11 years. She wore the same gray coat with the missing button on the 3rd buttonhole that had been missing for at least 2 years. A teenager I knew only as young Mark Rivera was among them. He was Brian's nephew. He helped at the quay on weekends and had once helped me carry a replacement lens element up from the supply boat. He was maybe 16, tall and lean like the Rivera men, but still growing into himself. Raymond Bradley and Walter Bradley were still there. Raymond was on his feet again, standing near the base of the headland path. Walter was beside him. 4 others I could not identify clearly. The rain was too heavy and the light was failing. They came up the path in a loose group, not running, not hurrying. The way they moved reminded me of something, but I could not place what it was. They arranged themselves around the cottage in a loose ring and began striking the walls. Not just hands this time. Rocks from the path. A boat hook someone had carried up from the quay. A length of timber that might have been part of a fence post. The cracked window gave entirely on the 3rd blow, and I heard the glass hit the floor inside. I moved to the interior door, the one at the back of the cottage that opened onto the tower stairs, and put my hand on the bolt. My right hand, the one with the cut across the base of the index finger. The dish towel was still wrapped around it and the knot was coming loose. Then every person outside went rigid at the same instant. I had my eye at the broken window when it happened. 1 second they were striking the walls. The next, every one of them had stopped and gone completely still. The arrested mid-motion posture of a film paused. Raymond's arm was still raised with a rock in his hand. Carolyn Dean was frozen with both hands against the cottage wall. The teenager Mark was on his knees, but his body was locked upright like someone had pulled him taut. Then they dropped. Not fainting. The drop was too fast, too simultaneous. Every body hitting the ground within a second of every other. Raymond went down hard on his side. Carolyn collapsed forward, and her face hit the path stones. Mark twisted as he fell and landed face up with his arms out. They were convulsing, hands pressed to their heads, fingers digging into their scalps. A sound was coming from the group that I would spend weeks afterward trying to accurately describe and could not. It was not screaming. It was not the sound of people in pain, or not only that. It was something else, something I had never heard before and hoped to never hear again. It lasted approximately 45 seconds. I stood at the interior door and did not move and did not breathe, and watched 9 people seize on the ground around the cottage. Raymond's back was arched so far I thought his spine would break. Liam Rivera was clawing at the sides of his own head. The sound kept going, that terrible sound, and I realized I was holding my breath and my lungs were starting to burn, but I could not make myself inhale. Then it stopped. The sound cut off like someone had thrown a switch. The convulsions stopped at the same instant. For maybe 3 seconds there was complete silence except for the wind and the rain. Then they began, slowly, to push themselves back up. Raymond got to his hands and knees first. Then Walter. Then the others, one by one, getting up from the path like people waking from a bad fall. Their movements were slow and unsteady, but they were getting up. I heard the Coast Guard vessel before I saw it. The engine note of a rigid inflatable working hard against the swell, coming around the north face of the headland into the small inlet below the lighthouse. A routine welfare check. I understood immediately. My failed distress call on Channel 16, the brief voice that had told me to stay where I was. Someone had logged the contact and sent a boat. 2 crew aboard. The orange and gray of HMCG livery was visible even in the low light. I got the cottage door open and ran for the cliff edge above the inlet. The path to the inlet went down steeply to the left of the lighthouse. The people from the village were between me and it. Most of them were still on their knees, still recovering but beginning to stand. I ran to the cliff edge instead, to the point where I could look directly down into the inlet, and I screamed at the boat to go back. Go back. Stay off. Do not come ashore. I was screaming Declan's name before I had consciously registered that the figure in the bow was Declan Farrell. 25. A Stornoway-based Coast Guard crew member who had done this run to the Dunvara Lighthouse twice before, who had once sat in my cottage for 20 minutes drinking tea and talking about whether he should apply for the full-time position in Ullapool. He had a wife. I remembered that. He had mentioned her during that conversation. She worked at the Stornoway Hospital as a nurse. Declan waved from the bow. Then he jumped into the shallows and started wading toward the inlet path. The people on the headland above responded to the movement and to the new person. Not thought, not decision, just immediate directional motion. They turned toward the inlet and began moving down the path. They were between me and the inlet path. I could not get to it in time. I watched from the cliff edge, 30 feet above, until it was finished. The second crew member, still aboard, threw the engine into reverse and took the inflatable out of the inlet and around the headland. The engine sound faded. The inlet was quiet, except for the sea. I went back to the cottage. I bolted the door. I sat on the floor with my back against it and my knees up and my hands on my knees, and stayed there for a while. I do not know how long. Long enough that the light outside changed. Long enough that the rain let up slightly. Long enough that my legs started to cramp. Then I stood up and took stock. The cottage was no longer defensible. The window was gone. The door bolt was a single old mechanism that had already taken significant impact. The people outside were recovering. What was defensible was the lamp room. The lamp room at the top of the tower had a solid steel access hatch that bolted from the inside with a 6-inch throw bolt and a secondary bar latch. It had been designed to be weather sealed against North Atlantic gales and had been doing that job for 140 years. Nobody was getting through it from below without equipment they had not brought. I filled my largest water bottle from the rainwater tank on the roof. The tank was 3/4 full. I took a tin of oatcakes and a bar of chocolate from the shelf. I took my VHF handset and my wool blanket and the small LED torch from the emergency kit. Then I climbed the 42 stairs to the lamp room. I sealed the hatch. The throw bolt went in smooth. The bar latch dropped into place with a solid metallic sound that I felt in my chest. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and sat down with my back against the lens housing. The automated light turned above me, the lamp and its prisms rotating on the 4-second cycle, throwing its beam out over the black water and back, out and back. Through the lamp room's glass panels, I could see nothing but the beam and the dark and the sea. Below me, through the steel hatch and the stone of the tower, I could hear the sounds of the people moving through the cottage. Impacts. Things breaking. The particular sound of the shelf unit going over. I knew that sound. I had heard it once before when I was moving it to clean behind it, and it had tipped forward, and I had caught it before it fell. This time I did not catch it. This time it went over and hit the floor, and I heard the wood split. I sat with my back against the lens housing and ate 2 oatcakes and drank a small amount of water and listened to the beam mechanism turning above me and waited. The sounds stopped sometime before 4 in the morning. I had been checking my watch every 20 minutes or so. At 3:40, the cottage below was still loud. At 4:10, it was silent. I waited another 3 hours. I sat with the blanket and the handset in the dark outside the glass and let the 3 hours pass. The beam kept turning. 4 seconds. Out and back. Out and back. I thought about Declan Farrell wading through the shallows toward the inlet path, the way he had waved. The big, reassuring wave. I'm here. It's all right. I thought about his wife, the nurse at Stornoway Hospital. I did not know her name. I ate another oatcake. I drank another small amount of water. The bottle was still mostly full. The beam kept turning. I waited another 3 hours after the sound stopped. I sat with the blanket and the handset in the dark outside the glass and let the 3 hours pass. Then I opened the hatch and came down. The cottage was wrecked, the table overturned, the shelf unit down, the books scattered and some of them torn, the gas hob pulled loose from its fitting. My chest of drawers had been dragged into the main room and broken open. The VHF set was on the floor, its casing cracked. I picked it up and tried it. Same flat warble on every channel it had been producing since morning. I stepped outside. The coastal path was littered with bodies. Every person who had come up from the village, all 9 of them, was dead. They lay on the path and the headland grass in the positions they had last occupied. Some on their sides, some face down. One with an arm extended as if reaching for something. Raymond Bradley and Walter Bradley were among them. Carolyn Dean, Brian Rivera and Liam Rivera, young Mark Rivera. 4 others I had not been able to identify in the rain. Declan Farrell's body was at the base of the inlet path. I walked the path slowly. I looked at each face. I had known most of these people for a decade. I knew Raymond's particular way of standing with his weight on his left foot, and I could see it even now, the left leg still slightly bent. I knew Carolyn's gray coat with the missing button on the 3rd buttonhole, which had been missing for at least 2 years. The sea was flat and gray, the storm blown through in the night, the water carrying the particular exhausted calm that follows a hard blow. The lighthouse beam was still rotating above me in the early light, still making its 4-second sweep, still doing its job. I stood at the end of the path for a while and looked out at the Minch. Then I went back inside and sat at the table and waited for whatever was coming next. It came at roughly 9 in the morning. A gray government vessel. No livery I recognized. No marking at all. It anchored in the inlet. 6 people came ashore in hazmat suits, white Tyvek, full respirators, carrying documentation equipment and sample cases. They moved efficiently and without urgency among the bodies on the path, photographing, tagging, recording. A 7th person came ashore behind them, a man in a plain, dark, waterproof jacket. No insignia, no uniform, carrying nothing. He was perhaps 55, with a lean face and the unhurried manner of someone who had done this kind of thing before and found it neither pleasant nor particularly troubling. He told me his name was Connolly and asked me to sit down. I sat. Connolly sat across from me at the overturned table. He righted it first, without comment, as if tidying up before a meeting. Then he began. A compound had been introduced into the freshwater reservoir feeding Dunvara village's supply, he said, approximately 3 miles upstream from the village intake. The compound suppressed a specific set of regulatory proteins in the human brain, producing, after approximately 8 hours of sustained intake, extreme territorial aggression and a complete loss of pain response. The convulsions I had witnessed were a terminal cascade. The compound exhausted its effect in a final neurological event that was uniformly fatal. He spoke in the unhurried manner of a man delivering a briefing he had delivered before. The compound was synthesized as part of a behavioral response program being run by a unit I'm not going to name, he said, in isolated coastal and island communities in Scotland and Wales, cycling through village water systems and monitoring outcomes. Dunvara was the 8th site. The program has been running for 3 years. I looked at him and said nothing. He told me that my rainwater tank had kept the compound out of my system entirely. Then he told me the other thing. The calcified cyst near my brainstem. The benign, monitored, otherwise ignored finding from my Regmore CT scan. It had interacted with the compound's protein pathway in a way that would have conferred immunity regardless. You were doubly protected, Connolly said. That's an unusual circumstance. It's been noted. I looked at him across the table. He told me that the program was ongoing. He told me that my immunity had been logged. He told me, quietly and without any particular emphasis, what compliance looked like. A lighthouse keeper already trusted and in place, with a legitimate professional reason to be in isolated communities, with a record of stability and discretion that 11 years of solitary posting had thoroughly established. He did not describe the alternative in detail. The path outside the cottage and the vessel in the inlet describe it adequately, he said. I looked at him across the righted table and said nothing. Connolly stood, buttoned his waterproof jacket, and walked back down the inlet path toward the gray vessel, and I sat at the righted table in the wrecked cottage and watched him go through the empty window frame where the glass used to be. 8 weeks later, I was the keeper of a lighthouse on Stockholm Island, off the Pembrokeshire coast of Wales. The posting had come through official Northern Lighthouse Board channels. The transfer paperwork was entirely in order. The board's covering letter cited my experience and the vacancy created by the previous keeper's early retirement. Stockholm was a small island, a nature reserve managed by the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales. There was a permanent population of 12 people running the reserve's research station and maintenance operations, plus a seasonal fishing operation working the inshore grounds to the north. The handover documentation was waiting for me in the cottage when I arrived. I read through it carefully, checking off the items one by one. Radio protocols, equipment maintenance schedules, emergency contact numbers, supply delivery dates. And then, on the 3rd page, a single line in the facilities section, freshwater cistern serviced 22 April. I read that line twice. The first time I read it like any other fact in the documentation. The second time I noted it, without knowing yet why it seemed important, and then knowing exactly why. The island used a cistern system fed by rainfall and a small spring on the eastern slope. The cistern was concrete, buried, with a pump house and filtration setup that dated back to the 70s. According to the documentation, the trust contracted the servicing to a mainland firm out of Milford Haven. They came over once a year in spring to inspect the system, flush the lines, and replace the filters. This year they had come on the 22nd of April. I had arrived on the 28th. I closed the documentation and set it on the table. Then I unpacked my things. I had brought my own water bottles. I had 6 of them, the same kind I had been using at Dunvara, 1-liter capacity with screw caps. I filled all 6 from the bottles I had brought on the ferry, not from the tap, and stacked them on the shelf beside the small gas hob. On my second evening, one of the island's permanent residents came to the lighthouse cottage to introduce himself. I heard his footsteps on the path before I saw him. The knock was 3 taps, unhurried, the knock of someone who had all evening and knew it. I opened the door. He was in his late 60s, stocky build, with white hair and a weathered face that creased when he smiled. He wore a thick wool jumper and work trousers and rubber boots with the mud still on them. He was carrying something wrapped in a cloth. "Hugh Griffiths," he said, extending his free hand. "Thought I'd come up and say hello. You're Samuel, is that right?" "That's right." "Good to meet you. I brought you something." He handed me the cloth bundle. It was still warm. I unwrapped it and found a loaf of bread inside. brown and dense with a cracked crust. "Baked it this morning," he said. "I do a batch most weeks. Keeps me busy." "Thank you. Mind if I come in for a bit? I know you're probably still settling, but I like to meet the new keepers. We don't get many people out here as it is." I stepped aside and let him in. He looked around the cottage with the easy familiarity of someone who had been here before, probably more than once, with previous keepers. He nodded at the table and I gestured for him to sit. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, setting his elbows on the table. "You want some water?" I asked. "If you're offering." I filled a glass from the tap and set it in front of him. Then I filled my own bottle from the stack on the shelf and sat down across from him. Hugh drank half the glass in one pull, set it down, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "So," he said, "how are you finding it so far?" "Fine. Quiet." "It's that," he agreed. "Quiet's what most people come here for, though. The researchers, I mean. And us old-timers. The young ones on the summer contracts, they don't always last. Get island fever after a month and can't wait to get back to the mainland. But you've done remote postings before, haven't you?" "Dunvara. 11 years." He nodded slowly, impressed. 11 years. That's a proper stint. You must like the solitude." I didn't answer that. He didn't seem to need me to. He finished the glass and I refilled it from the tap without asking. He drank that one more slowly, looking around the cottage as he talked. "There's 12 of us here year-round," he said. "Mostly research staff, bird counts, habitat surveys, that sort of thing. I'm semi-retired, but I help out with maintenance and odd jobs. Keeps me useful. My wife passed 4 years ago, and I didn't fancy sitting around in Haverfordess doing nothing, so I applied for the residency program the trust runs. Best decision I ever made, if I'm honest." He paused, finding the next thought. "The birds are incredible," he said. "Puffins, Manx shearwaters, razorbills. The puffins come back in April and nest in the burrows on the south slope. You'll see them soon if you haven't already. The light in April when they come back is—" He stopped, searching for the word, and when he found it, he smiled. "Particular. That's the word. Particular. Everything gets sharper somehow." I nodded. I drank from my bottle. He talked for an hour. He told me about the island's rhythms, the supply boat that came twice a month, the volunteer groups that visited in summer, the seasonal fishing operation that worked the northern grounds, weather permitting. He told me about the researchers, naming them one by one, describing their projects in the affectionate, slightly bemused tone of someone who didn't fully understand what they were doing, but respected them for doing it. Then he told me about his grandchildren. 3 of them, he said. 2 boys and a girl. The eldest is 8. Her name's Megan. She wants to be a marine biologist. He said, "marine biologist," slowly, enunciating each syllable, as if the phrase itself gave him pleasure. "I keep telling her this island is the best classroom she could have," he said. "If her parents would ever let her visit. But they worry. Think it's too remote, too risky. Maybe when she's older." He smiled when he said classroom. It was the same kind of smile he had given when he found particular earlier, the smile of someone who liked words, who took small pleasure in finding the right one. He finished the second glass of water and stood up, groaning slightly as his knees straightened. "I'll let you get settled," he said. "If you need anything, I'm in the cottage past the research station. Green door. You can't miss it." "I'll remember that." "Good. Welcome to Stockholm, Samuel. I think you'll like it here." He folded the cloth that had held the bread and tucked it under his arm. I walked him to the door and watched him go. He moved easily, unhurried, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The evening light was low and golden, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it was. He raised one hand in a wave without turning around, and I raised mine in return, though I don't think he saw it. I stood in the doorway until he was out of sight. Then I went back inside and sat at the table. The loaf of bread was still on the cloth where I had set it. I broke off a piece and ate it. It was good, dense and slightly sweet, still warm in the middle. I sat there for a while, chewing slowly, thinking about Hugh Griffiths and his 8-year-old granddaughter who wanted to be a marine biologist. Thinking about how he had smiled when he said classroom. Thinking about the 2 glasses of water he had drunk from the tap while we sat together. Thinking about the cistern that had been serviced on the 22nd of April, 6 days before I arrived. Then I stood up and walked back to the lighthouse. The lamp was already running on its automated cycle. I climbed the spiral staircase to the lamp room and began my evening lens check. The cloth, the optical cleaner, the careful circular motion across each prism face. The lamp rotated on its 4-second cycle, throwing its beam out over the black water of St. Bride's Bay. Below me, the island's 12 residents were in their quarters. The freshwater cistern had been serviced the week before I arrived. I realized, somewhere between the lens and the beam and the dark water outside the glass, that I had stopped feeling anything about what was going to happen to Hugh Griffiths. I had registered it, filed it, moved past it. This was not peace. It was not numbness. It was not the particular detachment I had cultivated after Owen, the functional distance that had allowed me to live alone for 11 years and call it preference instead of exile. It was something else, something that had not been there before the 6th of March and was there now. Permanent, structural, a load-bearing change. I understood, standing in the lamp room with the cloth in my hand and the beam turning above me, that this was the thing that frightened me most. Not what was going to happen on Stockholm Island, not what had already happened at Dunvara, not the gray vessel or Connolly's quiet voice or the path lined with bodies or Declan Farrell waving from the bow of the Coast Guard boat. The fact that I could sit across a table from Hugh Griffiths and his grandchildren's stories and his warm bread and feel nothing at all. I walked back down to the cottage. Hugh was long gone by now, back in his quarters with the green door, probably heating up his supper or reading a book or thinking about his 8-year-old granddaughter who wanted to study the sea. I stood in the doorway and looked out across the island. The evening light was fading. The paths were empty. The residential quarters were quiet, their windows beginning to glow as people turned on their lamps. Hugh Griffiths was somewhere out there, easy and warm, living the last normal evening he would ever have. And I felt nothing. I understood, standing there in the doorway with the dark coming on and the beam beginning its sweep above me, that the feeling nothing was the thing I would not recover from. I went up to the lamp room and began my evening lens check. The cloth in my hand felt the same as it always had. The small bottle of optical cleaner made the same sound when I unscrewed the cap. The careful circular motion across each prism face was the same motion I had made in every lamp room I had ever tended, the same motion I was making when Bobby Noble's fists hit the cottage door at Dunvara 8 weeks ago. I worked through the prisms methodically, one after another, checking each face for salt deposits or grit before moving on to the next. Below me, through the lamp room's glass panels, the black water of St. Bride's Bay stretched south and west. The island's 12 residents were in their quarters for the night. The freshwater cistern had been serviced the week before I arrived. I knew what that meant. I had known since I read the handover documentation on my first day here. I thought about Hugh Griffiths pausing mid-sentence to find the right word, and then smiling when he found it. That small, pleased look on his face when the word came to him. I thought about the girl of 8 in Haverfordwest who wanted to be a marine biologist and who had been told this island was the best classroom she could have. I thought about Owen, 19 years old, and the boat I bought him for his birthday, and the end of that line of thinking, which was still the end of that line of thinking, which had not changed. I thought about Connolly righting the table before sitting down, the small domestic gesture in the wrecked cottage, and what it meant that he had done that. As if we were just 2 men having a conversation. as if the path outside was not littered with bodies. The lamp rotated on its 4-second cycle, throwing its beam out over the black water of St. Bride's Bay and back, out, and back. I moved the cloth in careful circles across the last prism face. Below me, in the residential quarters, the 12 people on the island were going about their evening, making tea, reading, talking, drinking from the tap without thinking about it, because there was no reason to think about it. I finished the lens check. I set the cloth down on the housing. I sat with my back against the lens housing, the blanket I had brought up from the cottage around my shoulders, the same wool blanket from Dunvara, which I had brought with me, which was one of the things I brought. I watched the beam make its sweep, out and back, out and back. The mechanism turned above me with the same sound it had always made, the quiet clicking of gears and the low hum of the motor, the 4-second rhythm that had been my companion for so many years. I could feel it in my sleep. I did not go back down. I sat in the lamp room and waited for morning. The beam swept over St. Bride's Bay, lighting up the water in a brief flash before swinging away into the darkness again. Below me, the island drank. I thought about all of this. I sat with my back against the lens housing, and I thought about Hugh Griffiths and his grandchildren and his warm bread. I thought about the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales and the research station and the seasonal fishing operation working the inshore grounds to the north. I thought about the 12 people down there in the dark, drinking their tea, brushing their teeth, filling their water bottles for tomorrow, doing all the things people do when they trust the water. The beam swept out over the water, 4 seconds, out and back. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. The lamp room was cold, the stone walls holding the chill even when the day had been warm. My breath made small clouds in the air. Through the glass panels, I could see nothing but the beam and the dark and the sea. I tried to remember if Owen had looked at me before he got into the boat that morning. If he had waved. If I had waved back. I could not remember. That was the thing about the end of that line of thinking. It was not that I did not want to go there. It was that when I tried to go there was nothing to find. Just the absence where the memory should have been, and the knowledge that the boat had been a gift, and that I had bought it for him, and that he was 19 years old. The lamp turned. The beam swept. The 4-second cycle continued. Below me, in the residential quarters, someone turned off a light. Then another. The island was settling in for the night. Tomorrow they would wake up and make breakfast and go about their work. The birds would need monitoring. The trails would need maintaining. The seasonal fishermen would head out to check their nets. Hugh Griffiths would probably bake another loaf of bread. He seemed like the kind of man who baked bread regularly, who found pleasure in small things, who smiled when he found the right word. I sat with the cloth beside me and the blanket around my shoulders and watched the beam make its sweep, out and back, out and back. The mechanism ran exactly as it was designed to run. The lens was clean. The lamp was rotating on its 4-second cycle. Everything was working as it was supposed to. That was my job. To keep the light burning, to maintain the equipment, to be at my post. I had always been good at my job. The beam swept out over St. Bride's Bay, lighting up the black water for a brief moment before swinging back into darkness. The island was quiet below me. The 12 residents were in their quarters. The cistern had been serviced the week before I arrived. I sat with my back against the lens housing in the lamp room of the Stockholm Lighthouse, the wool blanket around my shoulders, the cloth set down, the beam making its 4-second sweep out over the black water of St. Bride's Bay. Below me, the 12 residents of the island drank from the cistern in the dark. And I waited for morning.